Now, back to the Reserve Bank story and whether this is more smoke and mirrors, more political blame game than economic reform. When I caught up with economist and author Professor Gigi Foster, I asked her firstly whether the changes were workable.
I do think it's workable to make that sort of change, certainly, but the question is really whether this is just a political move or whether there will really be substantive reform in the kinds of decisions that we get going forward. I'll note that I think the recommendations are mainly aimed at taking Australia into an institutional architecture similar to what's already used in the United States, where there is, for example, what we call the Open Markets Committee, which is made up of regional Federal Reserve directors from across the country, and they are the ones who have expertise in monetary policy and collectively by vote, majority vote, set monetary policy.
Yeah, it does look a bit like window dressing to me. It's got bipartisan support already, but of course appointments to the Reserve Bank board previously have been made with the idea of having the right expertise on the board to make these monetary decisions. And there's got to be a concern, I suppose, even with a Labor government, that this new monetary board might be stacked out with union and union-affiliated economists.
And you've put your finger on the exact issue here that I'm concerned about, which is that this is kind of we found the culprit for the cost of living problems we're having, and we're now going to make a big change, sort of, attempt to market our way out of the colossal failure that we've seen, not just of monetary policy, but fiscal policy in general during the COVID era, as I've written about previously in the Great COVID Panic with my co-authors. And so it is a bit of window dressing. I think really the broader direction that we should be going in for a solution to the problem you've identified there is to put more responsibility for the appointment of important positions in the public service into the hands directly of the public. And we can do that because we know how direct democracy can be used to make such appointments. We've seen it in other countries. I've proposed with my co-authors a system of citizen juries.
Well, that's a radical and fascinating idea, and we'll come back to that another time, I think, because I also want to get to the idea here of what has happened to the economy as a result of COVID and the response to it, and the sense in my mind that Philip Lowe's being used as a bit of a scapegoat. He obviously got it horribly wrong in 2021 when he told the Australian public and the markets that there'd be no interest rate rises till 2024. Here he is.
I want to make it clear that this decision does not reflect a view that the cash rate will be increased before 2024.
Now, he was obviously hopelessly wrong. We've seen, 10 interest rate rises since then, and 2024 is still a long way off. But he's hardly Robinson Crusoe. All the state governments, the federal government, everybody got COVID wrong. They all overreacted economically. That's why we have so much debt and we have this inflation crisis now.
Precisely so. I mean, there is basically no human on the planet who could possibly know exactly what a cash rate increase is going to do to the economy in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. I mean, it's a very, very difficult thing to forecast. That's why we pay them the big bucks. But we also just are operating constantly in uncertain times. That's what the job of an economist is to make calls, and sometimes they're wrong. The joke is we've predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions, right? So I agree. I mean, he's a human being. There is no perfect foresight here. And so this kind of scapegoating, which I sense in this review recommendations, is kind of unfortunate, because I think it also appeases the public's appetite a bit for some kind of revenge or some kind of justice after they have seen such huge cost of living increases, which really were the fault not only of the RBA, and indeed not primarily of the RBA. It was a failure of governance more broadly, certainly inclusive of the Commonwealth governments and the state governments who decided to stop economies, lock everybody down, and then create these massive fiscal outlays, which have now burdened future generations with amazing amounts of debt. And I mean, I'm writing about this all the time. It's a huge intergenerational burden. So, we've kind of overlooked that culpability, the broader culpability, not just of the RBA, but of so many other institutions. And this is why I do believe reforms like the citizen jury and other sorts of direct democracy are really the only way to go if we want to avoid falling into this kind of hole in the future.
Just briefly then, to wrap up, you and I have discussed the COVID overreaction before. Particularly, we've talked about lockdowns and vaccine mandates and all sorts of policies that at the time some of us were calling out. At the time, some of us were sceptical about, but certainly with the value of hindsight, we can see were clearly overdone. And I've often called for a National Royal Commission into the COVID response. Perhaps that should include the economic response, the economic and fiscal response as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think so. And there have already been attempts to do reviews of policy. I mean, you can see behind me in my book with Sanjeev Sablock, which is a cost-benefit analysis of Australian lockdowns. Do lockdowns and border closure serve the greater good? That was put out by Connor Court Press in, I think, late last year. But there's also been an independent review, philanthropically funded, called Fault Lines, which you may be aware of.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, Peter Shergold.
And there may be other ones, right? So I hope we will get more. I hope we have more points of diversity that are now represented as we move forward, because that is a huge problem we've had also. Just a monoculture, a monovision, censorship of dissenting views. That is not how we progress as a society. We have to open up debate, open up dialogue, discuss the big issues, and not be afraid to do so.
Spot on. Have the contest of ideas. Thanks so much for joining us again, Gigi.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Yeah, all that economic mismanagement, they want to blame it all on Philip Lowe. Maybe he'll be sacrificed on an altar on budget night later next month. We will see.